Hi everyone, I'm Chyill and welcome back to another detailed champion guide. Today I'll be talking about Lucie, the Expelled Alchemist, and so sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Lucie is a ranged support champion who excels in helping her team with her various crowd control abilities, shields, and healing abilities that she has access to. In the right hands, she can be a very effective support champion and would be a massive pain to deal with for the opposing team, especially in 2 vs 2s. The reason for this is that she has access to almost every crowd control effect, and this makes her very effective at controlling the battlefield so that it favors your team, and good control is often a very powerful thing to have. Although I would say she's a bit lacking in the mobility department, I think she makes it up with the strong defensive abilities to survive and support her teammates. About her ease of use, I think that Lucie is not a beginner-friendly champion, and so learning to play with her will take a bit of time because I think that some game experience and knowledge must be had before being able to play with her effectively. Before we start getting into the meat of the guide, just like the other champion guides I have made previously for Ismo and Rokan to name a few, I have split this guide up into different sections and I have included timestamps directly to each section in the description below. As usual, feel free to skip ahead to the section that you need if you have already watched the video before. And again, we'll start the guide off with looking at Lucie's abilities before talking about her playstyle, strengths, and weaknesses. Then we'll look at her Battlerites options, and finally we finish off with some of my gameplay tips and potential combos when using Lucie. And so, without further ado, let's begin. First off, let's talk about her abilities. Lucie's left click or mouse 1 ability is Toxic Bolt, and it is a simple projectile attack which deals a decent amount of damage and applies the damage over time debuff on the enemy for some bonus extra damage. Pretty simple so far. Her right click or mouse 2 ability is a healing ability, Healing Potion. She simply throws a potion and heals the ally in the impact radius for an average amount of healing and applies the heal over time buff on an ally as well for more heals. To prevent spamming of the ability starts with 3 charges that replenishes over time but also recharges faster for each nearby ally. Next up, her spacebar ability is Barrier. Typically for most champions, the spacebar ability is a movement ability, but for Lucie, it is just a simple but very powerful shield that can be applied to herself or her ally. This shield ability is the reason why I think that Lucie is not so much a beginner-friendly champion. Not having a solid mobility ability makes it so much more important to have good positioning, and beginner players usually lack that sense of good positioning. What's more, because it is a shield ability, it requires a bit of forethought before using the ability, as using it on an ally that has already been hit doesn't heal back damage that have already been dealt. And this makes it so Lucie players has to be a bit more proactive rather than reactive when using this ability, and this difference can be difficult for inexperienced players. Because this ability is so important, I will go into more details on how to use this shield ability more effectively later on in the video. Moving on, Lucie's Q ability is Clarity Potion, and what it does is that it removes buffs from enemies and debuffs from allies, and then knocks enemies or orbs away from the center of the impact. I think that the debuff or buff removal is just secondary since not all enemies apply buff and debuffs, and the main use of the ability would be for the knockback. It might take a bit of creativity and practice to properly use the knockback, but when mastered, the knockback can be useful for things such as knocking back enemy melee champions that have gotten close to you, or knocking an already far away enemy further away from you and your team to single out the other enemy, or even knock the central orb toward your team to safely secure the orb. What I like to do is to knock people back into my ultimate radius when they try to leave it, and that is always fun too, though we will get to her ultimate ability soon if you don't know what that is. Next up, Lucie's E ability is Panic Flask. Panic Flask allows Lucie to throw a flask projectile that will deal damage and apply the panic debuff to the enemy that it hits, making the enemy run away until the effect is over, or 16 damage has been dealt to him or her. Super useful for singling out the other enemy, cancelling ability casts, or making enemies run into the damaging zone in sudden death. Haha. So that's all of Lucie's abilities that doesn't require energy. Let's talk about those that do require energy now. Starting with her R ability that costs 25 energy to use, it is her only movement and invincibility frame ability, Roll. As the name suggests, she simply rolls in a specified direction while avoiding incoming attacks. Pretty simple. Because it costs 25 energy though and has such a long cooldown, the ability should only be saved for absolute emergencies when you need to avoid key abilities that your enemies throw at you. Moving on, Lucie's first EX ability is Deadly Injection, and it costs 25 energy and it modifies her mouse 1 ability, so you can activate it with shift left click or by pressing the number 1 key. When the ability is activated, Lucie fires a projectile, and if it hits an enemy, it slows the enemy a little bit, and when the slow ends after 2 seconds, it explodes and deals a large amount of damage to all enemies in the area. The slow is quite little, but I like the burst damage from this ability. Next up, Lucie's second EX ability is a Shift E ability, Petrify Bolt. The ability costs 25 energy, and instead of shooting a panic projectile, this projectile applies the Petrify debuff on the enemy that it hits, granting a shield to the target that makes the target unable to move or cast anything for 3 seconds, or until the shield breaks. Like the base panic ability, this ability is also a very powerful ability to control the battlefield, since your team can then gang up on the unpetrified teammate. And finally, Lucie's ultimate ability on the F key is Crippling Goo. When the ability is activated, Lucie throws a vial at a targeted location, dealing some damage to the enemies in the area, and a large area of goo is created. Enemies within it are snared and suffer huge amounts of damage while they are standing in it. Being a large AoE ultimate ability, it has lots of combo potential and is very powerful when used at the right time, and when enemies don't have their escape cooldowns ready. And so that's about it for Lucie's abilities. Now, let us move on to her playstyle, strengths, and weaknesses. Lucie's playstyle, as you can probably guess, is a bit of a mixed one. She needs to play proactively and shield allies or herself with her spacebar just before damage lands, and she also has to play quite a bit reactively with her other abilities, like healing allies who have taken damage or CC enemies to capitalize on enemies' mispositioning. So basically, when playing as Lucie, one of the most important things to constantly be doing when your shield is ready is to anticipate enemy attacks and use shield as necessary on allies or yourself. Cooldown tracking is super important and useful to do this effectively, since it will help to know when enemies have their abilities ready and are about to engage onto you or your teammate. It is important to track the cooldowns of your teammates' abilities as well, since it is good to know when he or she would want to engage, and you can then preemptively shield your teammate. Analyzing the movement of all other players help with this a lot, since the players' movement tend to be more aggressive when they know that their abilities are ready, and so you can expect some incoming damage soon. Because of how immobile Lucie is, enemies may know to target you when your shield is on cooldown, so be prepared to roll away or use some form of CC for self-defense if you feel that your enemies might suddenly turn their attention towards you after you've used your shield. If you think a teammate can handle his own, then go ahead and just save your spacebar for your own safety, since you being alive longer greatly increases the chances your teammate survives as well. But having said that, it is still a good practice to try and learn to watch out for times when your teammate inevitably needs your shield, especially when his or her health is low, since it is likely that enemies will try their hardest to quickly bring him or her down first and may not try to divert their attention toward you. When you're not trying to use a shield, you can just DPS with mouse once when you have nothing to do, heal with a mouse 2 ability when there's healable damage to be healed, remove buffs or debuffs with Q, R to roll out of danger when space is off cooldown, or just control the battlefield with Lucie's various crowd control abilities. Lucie's Q ability is great for AWP control or further enemy zoning. Her E and EXE abilities are great for singling out enemies. Her EX Mouse 1 ability is great for some potential AoE and burst damage, and of course use her ultimate when enemies have used their escapes for massive amounts of damage. On to Lucie's strengths. I think that one of her biggest strengths is precisely what I was just talking about, and that is her access to various CC options. She has so many ways to control the battlefield that, in an ideal scenario, the enemies would almost be fighting against your team 1 vs 2 or 2 vs 3 in 3v3s a large amount of the time in a round. Another strength of Lucie's is her barrier ability. Now, she's not the only champion with the shield ability, but the thing about Lucie's shield is that it is very strong, it blocks 50 damage, and for most champions, that's about 25% of their health bars. If you and your teammate plays right, it is as though you guys are playing a game with 25% more health than your enemies. Super powerful, man. Another thing to note is that, as you know, once players receive too much damage, some damage becomes unhealable unless they collect those mini orbs or gets healed by the central orb. Prevention is better than cure, and that's why shields are so powerful when used correctly, since then you wouldn't need to worry about healing through those damage because it couldn't even be dealt in the first place. Another strength of Lucie's is the amount of options she has for her Battlerites choice in each round. This is a good thing because it allows you to adapt and react to how enemies play or to adapt to different team compositions. We haven't touched on Lucie's Battlerites yet, but you will see what I mean when we get to the Battlerites section later. On to Lucie's weaknesses. I think her biggest weakness is her immobility. Not only does this make her positioning an absolute priority since she gets punished super hard for being out of position, but it also means there's less room for error when playing her, and this can sometimes be quite stressful, and it also makes it so that she's hard for beginners to play with successfully. Another weakness of hers, I feel, is a lack of really strong heals. Her only option of healing in her base kit is a mouse to heal. Sure, her shield ability helps in keeping teammates alive, but if you made a mistake and you're a second late when using it, it is hard to heal through all that damage sometimes, and it will be quite a struggle from then on. Finally, I think that she's very weak without her teammate support, and this would probably not happen as often when in a party with friends or in an organized group, but if you're playing just a normal public game and there's no synergy with a teammate, it can be a really tough game for Lucie if her enemies know to capitalize on that. It is quite important for Lucie to have a teammate draw attention away from her, and she in return keeps the teammate alive. Lucie is already immobile to begin with, and if a teammate just runs around somewhere, and not only is it hard for Lucie to catch up to try to support the teammate should they need it, but she is also very vulnerable because of how immobile she is. If Lucie used her shield and CC beforehand, she cannot really stand and fight for very long since she lacks a lot of firepower being a support champion, and in situations like this, she would really need the backup of her teammate. And so that's about it for her playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Now let us move on to Lucie's Battlerites options. Once again, you can pause the video to slowly read through every single Battlerites if you wish before I go through my thoughts on her Battlerites, since it would take a long while for me to read it all out for you. And so pause now to read them all. Okay, now that you've read all of them, let's continue. In the first tier, I think it's a choice between potency and chaos most of the time. I feel like the area of shockwave from blast shield is a bit too small to be that useful at knocking people back, and usually you're using the barrier for defensive purposes anyway, so the damage is mostly irrelevant. While potency sounds like good healing, it is not very often that you'll be able to remove buffs and debuffs and really benefit from the healing or damage. It is still a decent pick, I would say, in the right situations, like maybe when you have an enemy that deals a lot with debuffs on your team, Varesh for example. Otherwise, Chaos would be the pick most of the time because it just makes it so much easier to land your E ability on enemies, and it also makes it so that more than one enemy can get panicked, which is pretty huge. Bear in mind the explosion goes off regardless if it hits anything, so effectively it also extends the range of your E ability by a little bit as well, so it's very useful. Moving on to the second tier, I think that all three Battlerites are viable in the right situations, and if you find that you can't keep up in healing, which can happen quite often since Lucie doesn't really have the best burst healing, Companion Potion is a great choice, as it boosts your main heal by about 30%. Adhesive Component gives you a potent snare effect on your Q ability, so if you find yourself using Q to knock back and CC enemy melee champions quite a lot, the snare might be very helpful in that situation. If you're not sure what to pick, or you just need a pick for most situations, Alacrity will never go wrong. A movement speed boost is always good in any game, and incorporating that speed boost with your barrier ability makes the ability even better than it already is. What's more, Lucie, being as immobile as she is, could also use any and all mobility boosts when she can get them. On to the third tier, all three choices are good too. So in this tier, if you're having trouble dealing meaningful damage on the enemy, perhaps because the enemy support is super on point with his or her healing, Weakening Toxic might be pretty good since it reduces incoming healing and some outgoing damage too. Very nice. If you need more crowd control, your E ability is your best bet, and Hysteria just allows you to have E ability ready so much more often. With Chaos in the first tier, you will almost never miss your E ability at range, and so it is as though your E ability has a whole 3 seconds reduction in cooldown, making it really quite a lot of time in a round. As you know by now, Lucie is really immobile, and so Swift Roll just helps a little bit more with that. Reducing the cooldown of roll is huge, and giving it a bit of a speed boost as well is like an icing on top. I would say it's definitely needed if you find yourself being targeted a lot by enemies. So yeah, tier 3 is a pretty big one for Lucie, so now let's look at the fourth tier. In the fourth tier are some good choices again. Stimulant is a pretty good buff for your team, since you can give a nice damage boost to whoever you heal, whether it be your allies or yourself. So if you find your team lacking a bit in damage, Stimulant is a good choice. Vampiric Toxic helps a bit with your survivability with that extra healing. It's pretty self-explanatory, while Agility helps with your movement speed. I think that out of the three, Agility is probably the least useful one despite it being a mobility boost for Lucie. The reason being that 10% really isn't that much, and enemies will still probably hit you just as easily with a speed increase, but I suppose if you don't need increased damage or survivability, you could go for agility. Though at that point, I don't see why you shouldn't take stimulant for the extra damage to just end the round earlier anyway. Finally, in the 5th tier, I think that sticky goo is usually the better choice. That speed reduction increase is massive, and if you use it right, enemies stuck in your ulti will be having a very bad time. There's no real need to take alchemy, since if you want to use your Q ability to knock people back into your ultimate ability, you really should be planning ahead to save your Q ability for that specific play anyways. So I think the opportunity cost of taking alchemy is just too huge, and sticky goo will be the choice most of the time. And so that's about it on Lucie's Battlerites. Now let us move on to some of my gameplay tips for playing Lucie, as well as some potential combos with her. My first tip for playing Lucie is to really mind your positioning. If you've watched some of my other Battlerites Champion Guide videos, you probably would have heard me say this multiple times by now, and the only reason I keep bringing up this point is because it is very important, and even more so for Lucie. Her lack of mobility makes it all the more important for her to have good positioning, since enemies can easily turn to focus her down if she messes up. So do be especially mindful of this fact when playing Lucie. Another tip to playing Lucie is getting those shields in at the right time. This is sort of like a reminder because her shield is that important. Since I went into quite a bit of detail on using Lucie's shield in the playstyle section before, you can just jump back to that section if you'd like to hear what I had to say about using the ability again. Don't forget to time those shields right. Next up, a good tip when playing Lucie is to try not to focus too much on healing or dealing damage with her mouse wand. She's not the greatest at keeping up the heals on teammates being damaged anyways, so try to remember that you have access to loads of CC options, and so you should definitely be trying to panic someone or knock someone back away from your ally or move the orb around, etc. You know, be creative and do other stuff with Lucie's abilities, otherwise you're wasting a lot of her potential. Moving on, I think it is important when playing Lucie to try to stick to your teammates more. It is easy to sometimes get carried away and be doing your own thing, while your teammate does his or her own thing as well, so try not to do that. It is good to try your best to keep your teammate alive no matter what, even if it means less heals for yourself, but compensate that by playing relatively safer to try to keep both players up at the same time. Lucie is extremely weak alone, more so than any other champion, so try not to be in that position. Another thing that players tend to forget is her damage over time and heal over time effects from her mouse 1 and mouse 2 abilities. Against a team with no support champions, spreading the damage over time with your mouse 1 ability is very good in keeping the pressure onto the enemy, and when multiple allies are in need of heals, spreading the heals around is good too, unless a specific ally needs immediate attention. Regarding champions that go well with Lucie, I think she goes well with champions that can combo with her ultimate, as well as champions that can hold enemies' attention. Melee champions are usually great for this, but it doesn't have to only be melee champions. Ranged champions who can deal loads of damage and know how to step in front and draw attention is usually a good teammate for Lucie as well. That way, Lucie can do her job in relative peace, since it might be difficult for your enemy to break through that sort of formation, and if they do, Lucie has so many ways to CC, and it might be dangerous for them to try to do so as well. And so, overall, I think Lucie is a great champion to play, having the ability to just control the battlefield so well and keeping allies alive with those clutch shields and heals or panics on enemies are super satisfying as well. Even though she is a bit weaker in 3 vs 3s because of how vulnerable she is when she is focused down by enemies, she is still very strong in 2 vs 2s, especially when paired with an ally who can sort of tank for her. And so yeah, that's about it for my Lucie guide. I hope you found it useful. I have tallied up the polls on my Ismo guide, and it seems like a Shifu guide will be up next, so subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for that. You can vote for which champion guide you want to see next after my Shifu's guide by clicking on the I button at the top right now. Also, you can check out my other videos too if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching my video, and if you enjoyed it, be sure to hit the like button, comment, and share this video with your friends as well. And so until next time guys, keep on gaming, stay chill, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.